Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video. And today I'm going to be finally attempting to catch up with the Bleak House read-along. So if you don't know, I'm currently hosting a Victorian-style serialised read-along of Charles Dickens's Bleak House, in which we reread this book over 18 months in the original monthly serialised parts that Bleak House was originally published in back in the 19th century. I am quite behind. The first few months of this year have been a bit insanely busy, so I've just got really behind on reading and making the videos for this. However, today I have read January's chapters and I'm going to be talking about January's chapters. I'm hoping the video on February's chapters will be up today as well, or if not today, then later this week. And the video on March's chapters should be up before the end of March or in the first week of April. So we should be back on track after the next few weeks. Today we're going to talk about January's chapters. So in the month of January, far back as it was, we read chapter 33, Interlopers, chapter 34, A Turn of the Screw, and chapter 35, Esther's Narrative. To start off, of course, with chapter 33, Interlopers. In this chapter we pick up where we left off with Mr. Guppy and Mr. Jobling / Mr. Weaver having just reported Crook's spontaneous combustion. Wasn't that a weird chapter, guys, if you remember that far back in time? An inquest is held. All of the same characters who appeared for Nemo's inquest turn up here to give information that is not very useful. Mr. Snagsby comes along to find out what's going on, finds his wife there suspiciously and suspicious of him, as she always is. And Mr. Guppy and Mr. Jobling are in disagreement about how to proceed next. Mr. Jobling, who is now going under the name of Mr. Weevil, doesn't want anything further to do with this house and this mess and this chaos. He wants to get as far away from Crook's house as possible and to have nothing further to do with it. Mr. Guppy, however, wants to get those letters that he promised he would give to Lady Dedlock that may or may not have been burnt with the body of Mr. Crook or may still be in the house. And he wants to go back and get the property, but Mr. Weevil disagrees. And then it turns out that neither of them can go back and investigate the scene because who should turn up but Mr. Smallweed, who was in fact the brother-in-law of Mr. Crook and now says all the property belongs to him. Lots and lots of drama and coincidences, as always in Dickens. Mr. Guppy therefore realises that he is not going to be able to search for the letters or know if they still exist, and so he goes to see Lady Dedlock to tell her that he will not be able to deliver the letters as he thought. She treats him fairly coldly, and on his way out, who should he run into but Mr. Tulkinghorn, which must provoke quite a lot of curiosity from Mr. Tulkinghorn as to what a lawyer's clerk who he knows and has seen before is doing talking to Lady Dedlock when he is Lady Dedlock's lawyer. So, points of interest in this chapter. One thing that crops up again and again in this chapter is the idea of fate and this ill-fated house. The idea that Crook's house is in some way cursed. Various characters talk about this as an ill-fated house, and Mr. Snagsby says, "What a fate there seems in all this." The house is described as an unlucky house, a destined house. Mr. Nemo, aka Captain Horden, died in this house, so did Mr. Crook. And we also know that a man called Tom Jarndyce, many years before, a relation of Mr. Jarndyce, shot himself through the head in this shop. And in fact, interestingly, of course, Tom Jarndyce shot himself through the head. Mr. Nemo, we know, was careless with his life and had an overdose of opium. And Mr. Crook, like the other two, also caused his own death by drinking so much alcohol that he exploded from the inside out. Only in Dickens, right? So there is this sense of this house as a kind of ill-fated, dangerous place where terrible things happen, and everyone seems to grow quite superstitious about this place, and they get Miss Flight out of the house and lodge her in a local inn because they don't consider it a kind of good place for anyone to be. Another thing it's worth noting, as it always is when they appear, is the relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Snagsby. Mr. Snagsby comes along to find out what's going on and finds his wife already there investigating for herself and very suspicious of him, as always. "My little woman," urges Mr. Snagsby in a piteous manner, "don't for goodness sake speak to me with that bitter expression and look at me in that searching way. I beg and entreat of you not to do it. Good Lord, you don't suppose that I would go spontaneously combusting any person, my dear?" "I can't say," returns Mrs. Snagsby. And at the end of their little exchange, she basically forces him to go home and forces him not to be involved in any way in the suspicious occurrences happening around this area. And another thing that is interesting in this chapter is, of course, Mr. Smallweed's involvement in it all. Mr. Smallweed, of course, turns up everywhere and gets his hands on everything he possibly can. And interesting to note, of course, that he turns up at the death scene of his wife's brother, and his main worry is the property, which makes sense knowing Smallweed as we do, and also knowing that there has been a lot of talk of how much money Crook might might have. Mr. Smallweed explains that he was not on good terms with Crook, but that by one of those random Dickensian coincidences they were in fact related, and then he says, unless he's left a will, which is not at all likely, I shall take out letters of administration. I have come down to look after the property. It must be sealed up, it must be protected. I have come down, repeats Grandfather Smallweed, hooking the air towards him with all his 10 fingers at once, to look after the property. And he indeed goes so far as to threaten transportation or the gallows for anybody who shall touch the property. I also want to talk about Mr. Guppy going to see Lady Dedlock. I think it's interesting that he does, because in many ways it would be easier for Mr. Guppy to disappear or to write a note of apology, but it is important and tells you a lot about Mr. Guppy as a character that he feels it is his duty, though it is awkward and though he is ashamed and though he is sorry he hasn't been able to be of service to her, he feels it his duty to go to her and to explain why. He's a bit scared of her, but he goes anyway because he feels it is his duty to do so. He goes, he tells her about Crook's spontaneous combustion, she asks if the letters were destroyed with the person, and he says he believes so, not really mentioning quite how little he knows about whether or not they were. And then he begins to leave the house. But in that house, at the same moment, there happens to be an old man of the name of Tulkinghorn. And that old man, coming with his quiet footstep to the library, has his hand at that moment on the handle of the door, comes in and comes face to face with the young man as he is leaving the room. One glance between the old man and the lady, and for an instant, that blind that is always down flies up, suspicious, eager and sharp, looks out. Another instant, close again. And after Mr. Tulkinghorn has encountered Guppy and double-checked that he is, as he thought, from Kendron Carboys, then Mr. Guppy sneaks away. Mr. Tulkinghorn, such a foil in his old-fashioned rusty black to Lady Dedlock's brightness, hands her down the staircase to her carriage. He returns rubbing his chin, and rubs it a good deal in the course of the evening. And that is, I think, all I have to say on that chapter, so let's move on to chapter 34, A Turn of the Screw. In this, we pick up once again with Mr. George and Phil, two of my favourite characters, and Mr. George has received a letter from Mr. Smallweed informing him that a bill for a debt of his that has always been renewed, that he's always been paying the interest on, is suddenly about to be called and forced down upon him, and he's suddenly going to have to pay it in full, which is quite bad because he doesn't have the money, and the guarantor for his debt is his friend Mr. Bagnet, who also doesn't have the money and who also has a wife and several children to support. So George is not very happy about this at all. He is called on by the Bagnets, and when he explains what's happened, Mrs. Bagnet is quite angry with him for putting their family in danger in this way, and George says that he will find a way to fix it. Him and Mr. Bagnet go to see Mr. Smallweed to try and plead with him, and he basically finally drops all of the hypocrisy he usually suggests to George and says, you know, I'm gonna crush you, you gotta give me that money. Then Mr. George and Mr. Bagnet go off to see Mr. Tulkinghorn, where they run in the corridor to Mrs. Rouncewell, and George talks to Tulkinghorn to try and get him to call off Smallweed and to stop the debt being called in, and he realises that the only power he has and the only thing he has that Mr. Tulkinghorn wants, the only way he can stop them is by giving Mr. Tulkinghorn a sample of Captain Hawdon's handwriting, which Mr. Tulkin had asked him for before, and it's pretty clear that Tulkinghorn and Smallweed have kind of conspired to force George to do this by calling in the debt, knowing that that is a power they have over him. He gives up the sample of handwriting. Mr. Tulkinghorn promises that Bagnet will not have to pay towards this debt and that he can protect him, and George goes back to dine with the Bagnets, feeling that he has done something a bit dodgy and a bit morally dubious, that while he has done something to protect the Bagnets, he has also done something which may injure his dead friend, Captain Hawdon. So, points of interest in this chapter. First, let's talk about Mr. and Mrs. Bagnet. I love Mrs. Bagnet, she's such a great character. I like her strength and I like her understanding, I like her cleverness, I like the fact that George just says he's a bit put out and she immediately knows what it's about, and she immediately flies at George for having put her family in danger in this way because she is very protective over them. She says, "You have done a shameful action and have deceived us cruelly. I tell you cruelly, George, there." And when George tells her he will find a way to sort it out, she says that she will put her trust in him and let him go on. And after she has left and George and Matt Bagnet go off together, they have a discussion about Mrs. Bagnet. And Matt says, "George, you know the old girl, she's as sweet and as mild as milk, but touch her on the children or myself and she's off like gunpowder. The old girl can't do anything that don't do her credit. More or less, I never say so, discipline must be maintained." "She's worth her weight in gold," returns the trooper. "In gold," said Mr. Bagnet. I tell you what, the old girl's weight is 12 stone 6. What? Would I take that weight in any metal for the old girl? No. Why not? Because the old girl's metal is far more precious than the precious's metal, and she's all metal, which I really, really love that bit, because I do think, like, saying that she is all metal, she's quite a tough woman, and I think that is kind of true. But also I really like the relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Bagnet, and I think it's really interesting as well to compare to the relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Snagsby, because in both of those relationships it is the wife who is the more dominant force and the man who is sort of fairly meek in comparison to his wife. But in the Snagsbys, who are not in love and who are not very happy, this leads to suspicion and conflict, whereas in the Bagnets, who are in love and who are happy and who care about each other and respect each other, it leads to a kind of productive marriage where they both kind of play their individual roles as their personality dictates. I also want to talk a little bit about Mr. Smallweed. I think it's interesting that this is the point where Mr. Smallweed lets his hypocrisy go and lets all of his pretense just go to the wind. He finally, now that he has Mr. Tulkinghorn so much on his side and that he knows the bad situation they have George into, it's no longer worth his while to be polite to George, and he just isn't anymore. Mr. Smallweed, purposely bulking himself in an aim at the trooper's head, throws the pipe on the ground and breaks it into pieces. That's what I mean, my dear friend. I'll smash you, I'll crumble you, I'll powder you, go to the devil. And here's the moment where Mr. Smallweed decides that he is no longer going to pretend that he is nice, and he's just going to admit to the world and to George that he is not a nice man at all. I think it's also interesting as well to see the brief little encounter with Mrs. Rouncewell and the brief insight we get into her personality. She has been seeing Mr. Tulkinghorn, and on her way out notices Mr. Bagnet and George and asks if they are military men. George is looking at something on the wall and does not turn, does not reply, but Mr. Bagnet does and says that they both have been formerly military men. I thought so. I was sure of it. My heart warms, gentlemen, at the sight of you. It always does at the sight of such. God bless you, gentlemen. You'll excuse an old woman, but I had a son once who went for a soldier. There is something very touching in the earnestness of the old lady's voice and in the tremble that goes through her quaint old figure, but Mr. George is so occupied with the almanac over the fireplace that he does not look round until she has gone away and the door is closed upon her. We get a sense that George is very distracted and very upset. He is very worried about the result of his actions on his friends, the Bagnets. It's very clear as well that he is very torn over giving up the sample of Captain Hawdon's handwriting. He doesn't know what harm it can do Captain Hawdon believing him dead, but he also believes that it is wrong and that there is no way that Mr. Tulkinghorn could want it for an honest purpose. And although he accepts that it is the only power he has and that it is the only way he can get Mr. Tulkinghorn to get off the back of him and Bagnet, but even when Mr. Tulkinghorn says to him, have you decided you're going to do it? He doesn't say, I will do it. He says, I must do it, sir. And you get the sense of just how forced he is. The trooper then takes from his breast pocket a folded paper which he lays with an unwilling hand at the lawyer's elbow. And when he is having dinner with the Bagnets, the children and the Bagnets all agree that George is not quite as cheerful as he usually is, and we get the sense that there are many things weighing on his mind. And he says to young Woolwich, one of the sons of the family, the time will come, my boy, when this hair of your mother's will be grey, and this forehead all crossed and recrossed with wrinkles, and a fine old lady she'll be then. Take care while you are young, that you can think in those days, I never whitened a hair of her dear head, I never marked a sorrowful line on her face. For of all the many things that you can think when you are a man, you had better have that by you, Woolwich. And you get the sense through that speech that he is thinking of the bad and the wrong and the less than moral things that he may have done in his life and the things that he regrets. We don't know very much about Mr. George's life, but we have heard him talk before about having been a bad son, and you get the suggestion that going to Mr. Tulkinghorn's office and giving up the letter to Captain Hawdon, feeling guilt about that, is making him feel guilt about quite a few other things as well. And that is all I have to say on that chapter, so let's move on to chapter 35, Esther's narrative. In chapter 35, we learn that Esther is slowly recovering from her illness, which, as I mentioned several chapters ago, we can assume to be smallpox or something similar. We learn that she is getting better, getting stronger, no longer contagious, but also that she has woken from her illness incredibly physically scarred. Charlie has taken the looking glass, the mirror, out of the room so that Esther can't look at herself, and she knows that the face that she used to know as her own will no longer be what her face looked like. She is visited by Mr. Jarndyce and by Miss Flight and sees Charlie, but she refuses to see Ada yet, partly because she worries that Ada will be sort of too distressed by the physical change in her face. She also learns from Mrs. Flight that Mr. Woodcourt has done fantastic things abroad, that there has been a shipwreck on the ship he was on and that he saved tons of lives and has been a kind of real hero and done these kind of amazing, great things that Esther really respects and admires him for. We learn towards the end of this this chapter that Esther is going to go and stay in Mr. Boythorn's house near Chesney Wold, because she wants a kind of change of scene for a bit and is going to go there with Charlie. We also learn that a mysterious veiled lady has taken a handkerchief from Jenny that used to belong to Esther and was inquiring about her after her illness. And also at the very end of this chapter, Esther finally admits to us that she was a little bit in love with Mr. Woodcourt and sometimes thought that perhaps he was a little bit in love with her, and that now she has been so physically disfigured by her illness, she is glad that there was never any agreement between them, because she worries that he would not want to marry her now she no longer looks as she did. So there is a lot to talk about in this chapter, a lot of really interesting things. To start off with, however, I want to talk about Esther's appearance and Esther's facial deformity and disfigurement after her illness, because this is really important in Bleak House and really powerful and interesting. I've spoken quite a lot in several videos about the way Victorian literature looks at ideas of beauty, and I've spoken about it in terms of Dickens quite a few times as well. In a lot of Victorian literature, it is very common for the heroine to be exceptionally beautiful. Heroes, it tends to matter less. The central male characters are not always good looking, or their looks are often not described. In a lot of Victorian literature, the main heroine of a book has to be beautiful, and that is like part of her goodness, because the Victorians have this idea about inner beauty representing itself on the outer form, the idea that if your soul is beautiful, your face will be beautiful, and things like that. In Dickens' early works, most of his heroines are very beautiful and not much else. This is true of characters like Kate and Madeline in Nicholas Nickleby, characters like Mary in Martin Chuzzlewit, characters like Rose in Oliver Twist, and I find it very interesting that in Dickens' later books that is very much not the case, and it's a really, really important and interesting transition throughout his works. I talk a lot about how gender and the kind of presentation of gender changes throughout his books, but beauty in women is valued much greater in Dickens' early works than it is in his later works, and it's very interesting that in his later works you get characters like Amy Dorrit in Little Dorrit, whose main defining physical feature is the fact that she's short. And then we also have Esther in Bleak House, who is fairly pretty in the first half of the novel, and from slightly over halfway through is very, very scarred by smallpox. I can't stress enough how important a point Dickens is making, and how revolutionary and feminist it is in a way, because, as I said, the Victorians have this constant obsession with the idea of internal beauty representing itself on the outer form. The idea that if you're morally good and morally pure, you will be beautiful. The figure of the angel in the house within Victorian literature, they're nearly always beautiful. Yes, they're good, yes, they're domestic, but they're also beautiful. It's very important that they're beautiful. And what is very, very, very important about Esther Summerson as a character is that she is incredibly good, and she is very angelic in many ways. She is presented as an angel in the house to a certain degree in her kind of domesticity and her hard work, her desire to be useful to people, her complete selflessness throughout much of the novel. But from halfway through the novel, she is not what Victorian society considers beautiful, and that is really important, and it's a really big deal. And Dickens is making a very big point in the first half of the novel by having a character who is an angel in the house figure who is illegitimate, and then the second half of the book he's also making another really, really big point by having an angel in the house figure who has a severe facial disfigurement. It's important and it's well done, and for the Victorian period it's also quite brave. So yeah, we're going to talk about this a little bit more as we go through the book, especially in terms of the way different characters react to her facial disfigurement. However, there's plenty of other things going on in this chapter to talk about as well. Let's talk a little bit about Esther's kind of illness and recovery. She talks about how she kind of struggles with delirium while being ill, and how she dreams of being on this staircase and kind of trying to forever to get to the top and not being able to reach it, which I think shows, one, how much she is striving to be well again, but also shows this kind of metaphorical climbing to heaven and climbing to goodness, and Esther's constant efforts to be as good as possible and to kind of raise herself in morality as much as she can. I think her recovery is really, really movingly described. I find it incredibly powerful to think of Esther kind of lying in bed so ill, like listening to Ada just like weeping outside her door because Ada's so worried about her and so desperately wants to see her and like be with her because she thinks Esther might die and she doesn't want Esther to be like without her when she dies. Oh, it's so sad. And also that moment where Esther is finally well enough to sit up in bed and drink tea with Charlie, and how like important a moment that is that she can finally do that is really, really lovely. We also get such a sense in this chapter of how much different people care about Esther and how much everyone is concerned for her. Mr. Jarndyce is so overcome when he sees that she is better, but also sees the scarring on her face, that he sits for a while with his hand over his face. But when he removed it, fell into his usual manner. There had never been, never can be, a pleasanter manner. And he says that Richard has been writing to him in panic, really worried about Esther, even though he hates Mr. Jarndyce now and does not want to talk to Mr. Jarndyce. He has been writing because he is so worried about Esther and he wants to know how she is. We also know that Caddy has been worried about her, that Miss Flight is desperate to see her, that some mysterious lady in a veil has been to see Jenny to ask about Esther and has taken away a handkerchief. At what other points in this book have we encountered mysterious ladies in veils? Anyway, it's also interesting as well to note the themes of Chancery coming back into this chapter and the worries that both Mr. Jarndyce and Miss Flight have about Richard. Rick mistrusts and suspects me, goes to lawyers and is taught to mistrust and suspect me. Here's I have conflicting interests, claims clashing against his and whatnot, whereas heaven knows that if I could get out of the mountains of wigglomeration to which my unfortunate name has been so long bestowed, which I can't, or could level them by the extinction of my own original right, which I can't either, I would do it this hour. I would rather restore to poor Rick his proper nature than be endowed with all the money the dead suitor's broken heart and soul upon the wheel of Chancery have left unclaimed with the Accountant General. It is a terrible misfortune, little woman, to ever be drawn within the influences of Jarndyce and Jarndyce. I know none greater. What a troop of fine, fresh hearts like his have I seen in my time turned by the same means. And then we have Miss Flight's conversation with Esther. And Miss Flight tells Esther a little bit more about her family history, how her father was drawn into Chancery expecting a judgment, how her brother and sister were ruined by it too, and how she kind of knows it will ruin her, but she kind of can't stop herself anyway. There's a cruel attraction in the place. You can't leave it, and you must expect. First, our father was drawn, slowly. Home was drawn with him. In a few years, he was a fierce, sour, angry bankrupt, without a kind word or a kind look for anyone. He had been so different, Fitz Jarndyce. He was drawn to a debtor's prison. There he died. Then our brother was drawn, swiftly, to drunkenness, and rags, and death. Then my sister was drawn, hush, never asked to what. Then I was ill and in misery, and heard, as I had often heard before, that this was all the work of Chancery. When I got better, I went to look at the monster, and then I found out how it was, and I was drawn to stay here. I know far better than they do when the attraction has begun. I know the signs, my dear. I saw them in Gridley, and I saw them end. Fitz Jarndyce, my love, I saw them beginning in our friend the Warden Jarndyce. Let someone hold him back, or he'll be drawn to ruin. Esther says that Miss Flight is a little bit mad, but actually when Miss Flight talks like that, Miss Flight is not mad. My God, is Miss Flight incredibly wise, and she knows better than anyone the misery that Chancery can cause, even though she's still embroiled in it herself. And let's talk a little bit about Esther and Mr. Woodcourt, because this is also something else interesting in this chapter, where Miss Flight tells Esther of the lives that Mr. Woodcourt has saved and the way he has proven himself a hero and a truly good man abroad saving lives. Esther says, and I did read all the noble history, though very slowly and imperfectly then, for my eyes were so dim that I could not see the words, and I cried so much that I was many times obliged to lay down the long account she had cut out of the newspaper. I felt so triumphant ever to have known the man who had done such generous and gallant deeds. I felt such glowing exultation in his renown. I so admired and loved what he had done that I envied the storm-worn people who had fallen at his feet and blessed him as their preserver. I could myself have kneeled down then, so far away, and blessed him in my rapture that he should be so truly good and brave. I felt that no one, mother, sister, wife, could honour him more than I. And then we have her final confession at the end of this chapter, which I find so painful and so sad. And now I must part with a little secret I have thus far tried to keep. I had thought sometimes that Mr. Woodcourt loved me, and that if he had been richer, he would perhaps have told me that he loved me before he went away. I had thought sometimes that if he had done so, I would have been glad of it. But how much better it was now that this had never happened. What should I have suffered if I had had to write to him and tell him that the poor face he had known as mine was quite gone from me, and that I freely released him from his bondage to one whom he had never seen? Which I find both incredibly touching and incredibly sad, because if he loved you, Esther, you are still the same person just because your face has changed. That's one thing. But also, Esther, forever self-denying, even now doesn't truly admit that she loves him. She admits that she would have been glad if he had loved her, which is not the same thing, but we know is the same thing, but Esther can't quite fully say it. So I think that's all I have to say on January's chapters of Bleak House. In the month of February, we read the next 3 chapters in the book, which were Chapter 36, Chesney Wold, Chapter 37, Jarndyce and Jarndyce, and Chapter 38, A Struggle. So my video on February's chapters should be up hopefully very soon. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching. Please let me know down in the comments your thoughts on these chapters and if you're still enjoying Bleak House, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.